Move her away from my seat now. I'm not sitting next to someone like that. The command snapped across the polished executive lounge, sharp enough to silence the quiet murmur of wealthy travelers waiting for private departures. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. The billionaire aviation investor didn't even look directly at the orphan girl she was rejecting. Her manicured fingers simply gestured toward security as if brushing dust from the armrest of her leather chair. Executives nearby pretended not to stare, though several exchanged amused glances. The girl's worn sneakers and faded jacket stood out painfully against marble floors and chrome tables. Security approached immediately. "Miss, you'll have to wait outside the lounge," one guard said, voice low but firm. No one expected the girl to argue. Instead, she quietly stepped back. Her hand tightened around something hidden inside her pocket. Moments later, the same runway these executives controlled would become a place where only she knew what to do. Because the person everyone ignores often carries the skill no one else has. Before we reach the exact moment when the metal in her pocket makes the billionaire's expression freeze in disbelief, remember this: the world often overlooks its strongest people. This isn't a story about money or status. It's about the quiet power of someone the powerful refuse to see. The girl they pushed out of the lounge was named Aria Vey. She didn't rush when security guided her toward the sliding glass doors. She didn't argue either. That alone confused the guard escorting her. Most people reacted with anger after being treated like that. But Aria simply nodded. "All right," she said softly. Outside the lounge, the sound of distant jet engines rolled across the private terminal. The air smelled faintly of fuel drifting from the runway beyond the hangars. Behind the glass walls, executives were already returning to their conversations as if nothing had happened. Inside, Doria Halberg sat back in her chair. The billionaire smoothed the sleeve of her tailored jacket, satisfied the inconvenience had been handled. Celine Halberg, seated beside her mother, looked toward the door the girl had just exited. "That seemed unnecessary," Celine muttered. Her mother barely glanced up. "This lounge is for clients and investors," Doria replied coolly. "Not strays wandering in from maintenance corridors." Celine frowned, but didn't argue further. Outside, Aria moved down the side hallway leading toward the service wing of the terminal. The corridor lights hummed softly overhead. She knew this part of the airport well. It was where people like her were supposed to be, places where power never looked. Workers in reflective jackets passed by pushing carts loaded with tools. One mechanic glanced at her and gave a small nod. "Back again?" he asked. Aria offered a faint smile, "Just helping where I can." The mechanic laughed quietly. "You know more about these machines than half the trainees here," she shrugged. "I listen." But her eyes drifted toward the massive glass wall overlooking the runway. Doria Halberg's private jet sat near the hangar, its polished body reflecting the afternoon sun like liquid silver. Ground crews moved around it carefully, preparing for departure. Fuel trucks hummed. Hydraulic lifts adjusted equipment beneath the wing. A distant turbine whine vibrated through the concrete floor beneath Aria's boots. Her fingers brushed the object in her pocket. The metal, it was small, old. The metal edges had been worn smooth from years of handling. Aria pulled it halfway out for a moment, letting the engraved eagle catch the hallway light. She remembered the voice that had once handed it to her. Her guardian. The only person who had ever believed she could do something important. "You don't panic during emergencies," he had told her during long nights studying aircraft diagrams. "Machines fail. People freeze. But the one who understands the system, that person decides who walks away." Aria slipped the metal back into her pocket. Down the corridor, the mechanic she'd spoken with suddenly stiffened. "Hold up," he muttered, staring toward the runway. Arya followed his gaze. Something wasn't right. Ground crew members were suddenly shouting. One of the equipment lifts near the jet had tilted sharply under the wing. A loud metallic crack echoed across the tarmac. Alarms began blaring from the aircraft. Workers scrambled away. Fuel line. Someone shouted in the distance. The mechanic beside her swore under his breath. "That's Halberg's jet." Arya stepped closer to the glass. Through the glare of the runway lights, she could see a technician trapped near the tilted lift. Mateo Cruz. She recognized him instantly. He had been checking the hydraulic brace only minutes earlier. Now the structure pinning him looked dangerously unstable. Fuel dripped from a loosened line onto the pavement beneath the aircraft. More alarms shrieked. Inside the executive lounge behind her, the executives were beginning to notice the commotion outside. Arya watched the scene unfold, her eyes narrowing slightly. Workers were panicking. Security teams were rushing toward the jet. But no one seemed to understand exactly what had gone wrong. And if someone tried to pull Mateo free the wrong way, the entire lift could collapse. Her hand tightened again around the metal in her pocket. Somewhere behind the glass wall, Doria Halberg stood abruptly from her chair as the alarms reached the lounge. "What is happening to my aircraft?" the billionaire demanded sharply. But Arya wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes remained locked on the runway. Because she already knew something everyone else had missed. Arya's eyes remained locked on the runway as the alarms screamed across the private terminal. The tilted hydraulic lift under the jet shuddered again, metal groaning like a wounded animal. Mateo Cruz was still trapped beside it, half-pinned beneath a support beam, shouting something no one inside the terminal could hear through the thick glass. Outside, crew members ran in frantic circles. Inside the lounge behind her, chaos was spreading. "What do you mean it's unstable?" Doria Halberg's voice cut through the rising panic. "Get him out of there." Airport supervisors were already barking orders into radios. "Shut down fuel flow now, clear the perimeter. Engineering team to runway 3. But Arya didn't move. She watched the lift carefully. The way it leaned. The angle of the hydraulic brace. The slow drip of fuel falling onto the tarmac. Her stomach tightened. If someone pulled Mateo out wrong, the pressure holding the lift upright would collapse. And when that happened, the entire support structure could slam down into the fuel line. Behind her, footsteps pounded through the service corridor as more airport workers rushed toward the runway. One mechanic stopped beside her. "You seeing this?" he asked breathlessly. Arya nodded slowly. "Yeah." The man shook his head. "Engineering's already on the way. They'll handle it. Maybe. Maybe not." Outside, 2 security officers sprinted toward Mateo and grabbed the beam pinning him down. Arya's voice came out before she even realized she'd spoken. "Don't pull that," the mechanic beside her blinked. "What?" But through the glass, the officers were already lifting. The beam shifted. The hydraulic lift creaked violently. Mateo screamed. Arya inhaled sharply. "Stop! Stop! You're going to—" Outside, someone shouted again. "Back away. Back away." The officers dropped the beam instantly as another engineer rushed into the scene, waving them off. The lift wobbled dangerously before settling again. Arya exhaled slowly. "Good," she whispered. The mechanic beside her stared at her now. "You called that before it happened." She didn't answer. Instead, she studied the aircraft again. The left landing support had partially slipped. Hydraulic pressure was uneven. The lift holding the wing was bearing too much load on one side. Anyone trained in emergency aircraft stabilization would recognize it instantly. But panic made people blind. Behind them, the lounge doors burst open. Doria Halberg stormed into the corridor with her security chief close behind. "What's the situation?" she demanded. Garrick Holt checked the runway through the glass. "Ground tech is trapped, ma'am. Structural instability under the aircraft." "Then fix it," Doria snapped. "They're trying." Celine stepped behind them, her gaze drifting across the corridor until she noticed Arya standing quietly near the window. Recognition flashed in her eyes. "You're the girl from the lounge." Arya said nothing. She simply continued watching the runway. Outside, engineers were arriving now, kneeling beside the unstable lift. They spoke urgently among themselves. One tried adjusting a control lever. The lift jerked violently again. "Careful," another shouted. Matteo groaned in pain. Fuel continued dripping steadily beneath the aircraft. Inside the corridor, tension thickened. Doria crossed her arms impatiently. "This delay is unacceptable," she said. "That jet cost $60 million. Celine looked at her in disbelief. "There's a man trapped under it." Doria waved the comment away. "They'll handle it," Arya finally spoke. "They won't." The words came out calm, quiet, but they carried enough certainty that everyone near the window turned toward her. Garrick Holt frowned. "And you know that how?" She nodded toward the runway. "Because they're stabilizing the wrong side." Silence fell for a moment. The mechanic beside her muttered under his breath. "She might actually be right." Doria scoffed. "Are we seriously listening to her now?" Arya didn't react. She simply watched as one engineer crawled beneath the wing to inspect the brace. The moment he touched the lever, the hydraulic lift shifted again. The entire aircraft dipped slightly. Gasps spread across the corridor. Even Garrick Holt's expression tightened. "Something's definitely off," he admitted. Celine glanced between Arya and the runway. "You knew that before they did." Arya shrugged faintly. "Just observing." The mechanic beside her shook his head. "That's more than observation." Across the tarmac, the engineering team stepped back again. None of them looked confident. Matteo's voice carried faintly through the open runway speakers now. "Please, just hurry." Arya's hand drifted to the metal in her pocket again. The cool metal pressed against her fingers. Her guardian's voice echoed in her memory. "Machines fail. People freeze. But the one who understands the system decides who walks away." Outside, the aircraft groaned again. Another engineer shook his head in frustration. "We can't move the beam without dropping the lift." The supervisor cursed. "Then what's the alternative?" No one answered. Inside the corridor, Arya slowly stepped closer to the glass. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They need to release pressure from the rear brace first." Celine heard her. So did Garrick Holt. The security chief narrowed his eyes. "How do you know that?" Arya didn't turn away from the runway. "Because the left hydraulic system isn't the problem." Everyone waited. Then she finished quietly. "The imbalance started in the rear support." The mechanic beside her whispered under his breath. "That actually makes sense." Garrick Holt looked at the runway again, then back at the girl who had been thrown out of the executive lounge less than 10 minutes ago. For the first time, the security chief's expression changed. Not dismissal. Recognition. And outside, the aircraft shuddered again because the situation was getting worse. Outside the glass wall, the aircraft groaned again, a deep metallic sound that vibrated through the concrete beneath their feet. The hydraulic lift tilted another fraction of an inch, and several engineers jumped back instinctively. Everyone clear the wing. Someone shouted across the runway. Matteo Cruz cried out again from beneath the beam. His voice carried through the open air this time, strained and desperate. "I can't feel my leg, please, just get this thing off me." Inside the corridor, the tension turned heavy. Celine pressed her palm against the glass. "They're losing control out there." Doria Halberg's patience snapped. "Why hasn't anyone fixed this yet?" Garrick Holt kept his eyes on the runway, because the structure isn't stable enough to move him safely. That's not an answer, the billionaire snapped. Another violent creak echoed from outside. Arya watched every movement carefully. The aircraft wing shifted slightly again, and she noticed something the others hadn't yet. The rear support brace had begun to slide. Her breath caught. That was the trigger point. If it slipped completely, the hydraulic lift wouldn't just tilt, it would collapse. And when that happened, the fuel line dripping beneath the wing could ignite from the pressure burst. The entire runway zone could turn into a fireball. Outside, one engineer crawled toward the rear of the lift to inspect the brace. Arya suddenly stepped forward. "Don't let him touch that." Her voice cut through the corridor like a blade. Everyone turned. Garrick Holt frowned. "What?" "The rear brace is already slipping," she said quickly. "If he adjusts it now, the pressure will dump onto the front lift." Celine blinked. "And that's bad?" Arya's eyes remained fixed on the aircraft. "It'll drop the entire wing." Silence filled the hallway. Outside, the engineer had already reached the brace and was reaching for the release valve. The mechanic standing beside Arya muttered, "He's about to do exactly that." Celine's voice rose. "Someone stop him." Garrick grabbed his radio instantly. "Engineering team, hold position. Do not adjust the rear brace." For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the engineer froze. His head lifted as the message reached his earpiece. "Repeat that?" The engineer shouted into his radio. "Hold position." Garrick barked. The engineer slowly withdrew his hand from the valve. Across the runway, the team backed away from the brace again. Matteo groaned weakly beneath the beam. Inside the corridor, everyone exhaled. The mechanic beside Arya stared at her. "You just stopped them from collapsing the whole thing." Doria Halberg folded her arms, though her expression had shifted slightly. Lucky guess, Arya didn't respond. She simply kept watching the structure. Because the danger wasn't over. Not even close. Outside, the supervisor of the engineering crew wiped sweat from his forehead and shouted across the tarmac. "Then how the hell do we stabilize it?" No one answered him. The runway lights flickered as emergency generators kicked on. Wind swept across the open concrete, rattling loose equipment carts nearby. Matteo tried shifting again beneath the beam. The lift groaned dangerously. "Don't move," one engineer shouted. "I can't breathe down here." Matteo gasped. Celine covered her mouth. "We have to get him out." Garrick looked between the runway and Arya now. "You said the rear support caused the imbalance," he said slowly. Arya nodded. "That's where the hydraulic failure started, so what's the fix?" The corridor went quiet again. Doria scoffed impatiently. "You're not seriously asking her." But Garrick ignored her. He watched the girl carefully. Arya hesitated. Not because she didn't know. Because she understood what would happen if she spoke. Every eye in this corridor would turn toward her. Every decision would suddenly depend on the girl they had just thrown out of the lounge. But Matteo groaned again outside. And the lift shifted another inch. There wasn't time to stay invisible. Her fingers brushed the metal in her pocket once more. Then she spoke. They need to bleed the pressure from the rear hydraulic line. Garrick leaned closer. "How?" "There's a manual release valve behind the engine housing," she explained calmly. "But it has to be opened slowly while the front brace is reinforced." The mechanic beside her whispered, stunned. "That's exactly how you stabilize uneven lift pressure." Celine turned toward Arya. "You've done this before." Arya didn't answer. Outside, the engineering supervisor shouted again. "We're running out of options here." The aircraft creaked again. Fuel continued dripping steadily beneath the wing. The runway was becoming more dangerous with every passing second. Garrick Holt stared at the girl now, the girl who had predicted the brace failure, the girl who understood the aircraft better than the engineers currently panicking outside. He lifted his radio slowly. But Doria Hallberg stepped forward. "You're not about to take instructions from her." Garrick met the billionaire's gaze. "She might be the only one here who knows what to do." Doria's expression hardened. "This is my aircraft." Outside, Mateo's voice cracked again. "Please, don't let it fall." The lift shuddered violently. Inside the corridor, Arya whispered quietly, "They're running out of time." And now everyone knew it. The hydraulic lift under the aircraft trembled again, a deep metallic groan echoing across the runway as the massive wing shifted another inch downward. Outside, engineers scattered backward, hands raised instinctively. "Everyone off the lift zone," one of them shouted. Mateo Cruz cried out in pain beneath the beam. I can't hold my leg like this much longer." The sound cut straight through the corridor. Celine winced. Doria Hallberg didn't. Her eyes stayed locked on the jet like someone watching a fortune wobble on the edge of collapse. "This is absurd," she said sharply. "Why are we standing here debating while that crew fumbles around out there?" Garrick Holt didn't answer immediately. His attention remained on Arya. The girl stood quietly near the glass, shoulders relaxed, eyes focused entirely on the unstable machine outside. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't guessing. She was studying. And that unsettled him more than anything else. Another engineer on the runway attempted to slide a stabilizing block under the front brace. The moment the metal wedge touched the lift, the structure groaned violently again. "Stop!" someone yelled. The engineer jerked backward as the lift dipped. The aircraft wing dropped half an inch lower. Inside the corridor, Celine gasped. Mateo screamed. "That's it," the engineering supervisor shouted into his radio. "We're losing the front support." Fuel continued dripping beneath the aircraft. A dark stain spread slowly across the pavement. Arya's jaw tightened. They were making the same mistake again, trying to reinforce the side carrying the most pressure instead of redistributing it. Her fingers curled into her palm. The metal in her pocket pressed against her skin. Her guardian's voice echoed again in her memory. Pressure systems fail quietly until someone forces them too far. Outside, another engineer dropped to his knees beside Mateo. "We're going to lift the beam slowly," he said urgently. "No," Arya said instantly. Everyone turned toward her again. Garrick Holt's radio froze halfway to his mouth. "If they lift that beam now, the brace will collapse," she said. Celine looked at her. "Then how do they free him?" Arya pointed toward the rear of the aircraft. "They have to release the hydraulic pressure first." Doria laughed softly. Incredible. The sarcasm dripped from every word. A maintenance stray giving aviation advice, but no one else in the corridor laughed. The mechanic who had been standing beside Arya since the alarms began leaned forward toward the glass. "She's right about the pressure imbalance," he muttered. Doria turned toward him sharply. "You're encouraging this?" "I'm saying the lift keeps shifting exactly the way she predicted," the mechanic replied. Another loud creak rolled across the runway. Outside, the engineering supervisor shouted again. "We need a decision." Mateo groaned weakly. "Please." Inside the corridor, Garrick Holt slowly lowered his radio. His eyes remained on Arya. "You said there's a manual valve," he said. Arya nodded. "Behind the engine housing. How sure are you?" She didn't hesitate. Completely, Doria stepped forward immediately. "This conversation is over." Her voice carried the cold authority of someone used to being obeyed. "You will not take operational orders from a girl who wandered in from the maintenance hall." Garrick didn't respond. Instead, he turned back toward the runway. The engineering team was arguing now. Two technicians pointed toward the front brace while another gestured toward the rear of the aircraft. No one looked confident. Another second passed. Then the lift shuddered again. The wing dipped dangerously lower. Celine's voice trembled. "Mom, if that thing collapses." Doria crossed her arms. "The professionals will handle it." Outside, Matteo cried out again. The sound carried straight through the glass like a blade. Arya took a slow breath. She had seen this moment before. Not here, but years ago. Training sessions in dim hangars, simulated aircraft failures, hydraulic lifts collapsing during rescue drills. Her guardian had always said the same thing when trainees froze. The person who understands the system must step forward, even if no one asks them to. Arya reached into her pocket. For a moment, the metal glinted between her fingers. Celine noticed it instantly. "What is that?" she asked quietly. Arya didn't answer. Instead, she looked back at the runway. The engineers were preparing to lift the beam again. The wrong move. The fatal move. She stepped forward, past Garrick, past the mechanic, past the billionaire who had ordered her removed minutes earlier. Doria Halberg's voice snapped behind her. "Where do you think you're going?" Arya stopped beside the corridor door that led directly to the runway. Her hand rested on the metal handle. She didn't turn around. Because her eyes were still on the aircraft, still on the trapped technician, still on the unstable lift seconds away from catastrophic failure. "They're about to make it worse," she said calmly. Doria scoffed. "And you think you'll fix it?" Arya opened the door. Cold wind from the runway rushed into the corridor. The smell of jet fuel filled the air. Outside, alarms continued blaring as engineers shouted over one another. Arya stepped onto the concrete. And for the first time since the crisis began, the girl they had thrown out of the lounge walked directly toward the failing aircraft. Cold runway wind whipped across the concrete as Arya stepped past the painted safety lines. The roar of distant turbines mixed with the sharp beeping of emergency alarms. Engineers clustered near the tilted lift looked up in confusion as she approached. "Hey, this area's restricted," one of them shouted. But she kept walking. Her eyes never left the hydraulic lift trembling under the aircraft's wing. The front brace was grinding against the concrete. The rear support had slipped nearly 2 inches. Fuel dripped steadily from the loosened line, splattering dark spots across the runway. Arya's voice carried calmly over the noise. "Stop touching the beam." The engineers stared at her. One of them blinked. "Who?" Behind them, Garrick Holt emerged from the corridor door, followed by Celine. The security chief raised a hand toward the team. "Hold your positions," he called out. The engineers hesitated. Doria Halberg appeared in the doorway behind them, furious. "What is she doing out there?" she snapped. No one answered. Because everyone was watching the girl now. Arya crouched beside the front brace, examining the hydraulic cylinder closely. The metal rod inside it shuddered under uneven pressure. She exhaled slowly. "Yeah," she murmured. "Rear pressure failure." One engineer frowned. "What?" She stood again. "You're reinforcing the wrong side," she said. The imbalance started in the rear brace. The supervisor stepped forward. "Kid, we've been doing this for 20 years, and the lift has shifted 3 times since you started," she interrupted quietly. The supervisor stopped speaking. Because that was true. Arya pointed toward the back of the aircraft. "You need to bleed the rear hydraulic line first." Another engineer frowned. "That valve's behind the engine housing." "I know," she replied. Matteo groaned beneath the beam. The sound cut through the tense silence. The supervisor rubbed his face. "If we release the rear pressure too fast, the front lift could drop." Arya nodded. "That's why someone has to reinforce the front brace while the valve opens." The mechanic from the corridor jogged over. "She's right," he said. "You stabilize the front manually while the rear pressure releases." The supervisor looked between them, then at the aircraft, then at Matteo. Another deep metallic groan rolled through the lift. That decided it. "All right," he muttered. "We try it." Arya moved quickly. "You," she said to one engineer, pointing at the brace lever. "Hold the stabilizer rod steady." She turned to another. "You're going to the rear valve." The engineer hesitated. "You're sure about this?" Arya met his eyes. Yes. Behind them, Celine stood near the safety barrier watching every movement. Her voice came out softly. "She knows exactly what she's doing." Doria folded her arms. This is ridiculous. But even she had stopped shouting, because the runway had fallen completely silent except for the alarms and Matteo's strained breathing. Arya knelt beside the front brace. Her hands wrapped around the stabilizing bar. "Ready," she called. The engineer at the rear of the aircraft leaned toward the hydraulic valve. "Tell me when." Arya looked at the lift one last time. Every vibration, every tension point, every movement of the aircraft wing. "Slowly," she said. The engineer turned the valve. A sharp hiss escaped from the hydraulic system. The aircraft shifted slightly. Celine inhaled sharply. The engineer at the brace tightened his grip. Arya held the stabilizer steady as pressure slowly bled from the rear system. "Keep turning," she instructed. The hiss continued. The rear brace lowered half an inch. The lift groaned again. Then, the front brace stopped grinding. The aircraft leveled slightly. The entire structure settled. The supervisor's eyes widened. "It's stabilizing." Arya nodded once. "Now hold it there." The pressure release slowed. The lift steadied. For the first time since the emergency began, the aircraft stopped shifting. The supervisor let out a long breath. "All right," he said quickly. "Now we move the beam." Two engineers carefully lifted the metal bar pinning Matteo. The technician cried out as they slid him free. But the lift didn't collapse. The aircraft didn't drop. Everything held. Cheers erupted across the runway. "Pull him back." Matteo was dragged safely clear of the beam. The moment he cleared the lift zone, the engineers stepped away from the aircraft. The runway fell silent. Only the soft hiss of the hydraulic system remained. The supervisor turned slowly toward Arya. "You just saved that aircraft. And him." She stood quietly. Hands dusty from the brace. Clothes streaked with grease. Celine walked forward. "You saved everyone." Doria Hallberg stared across the runway. Her voice came out tight. How did she know that? No one answered, but the mechanic who had first spoken with Arya earlier shook his head in disbelief. She didn't guess, he murmured. Arya wiped her hands on her jacket, then she reached into her pocket. The metal slipped briefly into the sunlight. The small engraved eagle caught the attention of several engineers. The supervisor stepped closer. "That metal," he said slowly. Arya slipped it back into her pocket. But it was already too late, because someone had recognized it, and the expression on their face changed everything. By the way, if stories like this hit you right in the heart, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And the expression on the engineer's face changed everything. He stepped closer to Arya, eyes fixed on the pocket where the metal had disappeared. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. The question cut through the runway chatter like a sudden silence. Arya paused. For a moment she considered ignoring it. But the engineer's stare wasn't casual curiosity, it was recognition. "I've seen that insignia before," he said slowly. Around them, several workers turned to listen. The engraved eagle on that metal wasn't decorative. It belonged to a very specific group. Arya slipped her hands into her jacket pockets. "It belonged to someone who trained me," she replied. The supervisor raised an eyebrow. "Trained you?" Before she could answer, the mechanic who had stood beside her earlier stepped forward. That stabilization method she used, that's not basic maintenance training. The engineer nodded. That's advanced rescue protocol. Celine moved closer now, curiosity burning in her expression. Rescue protocol for what? She asked. The engineer looked toward the aircraft. For emergency aircraft collapse scenarios, a murmur spread through the gathered workers. The realization moved through them like a wave. This girl hadn't guessed anything. She had known exactly what she was doing. Across the runway, Mateo Cruz was sitting upright now while paramedics checked his leg. One of them waved toward Aria. That girl is the reason he's alive, the medic called. Mateo followed the gesture. When he saw her standing beside the aircraft, recognition lit his face. That's her, he said weakly. She told them what to do. Inside the corridor entrance behind them, Doria Halberg stepped onto the runway with slow, measured steps. The wind tugged at her coat as she looked from the stabilized aircraft to the girl standing among the engineers. Her voice was colder now. So this is the hero everyone is suddenly celebrating. No one laughed. No one echoed the sarcasm, because every person standing there had watched what had happened. Celine turned toward her mother. She saved Mateo. Doria's eyes narrowed slightly. The professional saved him. The engineering supervisor cleared his throat. Actually, the situation wasn't stabilizing until she stepped in. Doria looked directly at Aria. You're telling me a teenager solved a structural failure that trained engineers couldn't? Aria didn't respond. She simply watched the paramedics lifting Mateo onto a stretcher. The technician caught her eye as they secured the straps. Thank you, he called weakly. She nodded once, then turned away. Because attention like this always made her uncomfortable. The engineer who had recognized the medal spoke again. That insignia isn't common, he said carefully. Garrick Holt had stepped closer during the conversation. His sharp eyes moved between Aria and the engineer. What insignia? He asked. The engineer hesitated, then said quietly, Air Force Rescue Engineering. Celine blinked. You mean military? The engineer nodded. That medal looks like one issued to combat rescue teams. All eyes shifted to Aria again. Doria Halberg folded her arms. So you're pretending to be military now? Aria's gaze lifted slowly. I never said that. Then explain the medal. The runway had gone completely quiet now. Even the engineers were listening. Aria's voice remained calm. It belonged to the man who raised me. Celine's voice softened. Your father? Aria shook her head. My guardian. She paused. He was an Air Force rescue engineer. The mechanic beside her let out a low whistle. That explains a lot. Garrick Holt studied her carefully. And he trained you? Aria nodded slightly. Since I was little. Doria scoffed again. So your explanation is bedtime lessons in aircraft engineering? The engineer shook his head. That training method she used, that's not something you learn from stories. Aria said nothing. But the memory flickered across her mind. Cold hangars. Night drills. Her guardian's steady voice explaining hydraulic systems while she held a flashlight under aircraft wings. Machines fail. People freeze. But the one who understands the system decides who walks away. Across the runway, the paramedics began wheeling Mateo toward the medical vehicle. Before they loaded him inside, he raised a hand weakly toward Aria. You saved me, he said. She shook her head gently. The team did, but the supervisor smiled. You gave us the plan. Celine turned toward her mother again. You threw her out of the lounge 10 minutes ago. The words hung in the air. Doria Halberg's expression hardened. That has nothing to do with this, but several engineers exchanged glances. Because it had everything to do with it. The supervisor gestured toward Aria. You should know, she probably prevented the aircraft from collapsing too. Doria's eyes snapped back toward the jet. The polished silver fuselage stood perfectly still now. the massive machine that had been seconds from disaster, saved by the person she had dismissed as someone who didn't belong. Doria studied Arya again, longer this time, carefully, as if seeing her for the first time. But Arya had already turned away. Her eyes were drifting back toward the runway equipment, toward the systems everyone else had stopped watching. Because emergencies didn't end the moment people started celebrating. Sometimes the real danger was still hiding inside the machine. Arya's eyes remained fixed on the aircraft long after the cheers around the runway began fading. Engineers were already gathering their tools, talking loudly now that the worst seemed over. But something about the jet still bothered her. A faint metallic ticking echoed from beneath the wing. Not loud, not obvious, but wrong. She stepped closer to the front brace again, kneeling beside the hydraulic cylinder she had stabilized minutes earlier. Her fingers hovered near the metal housing without touching it. The heat radiating from the machinery pulsed through the air. Behind her, the engineering supervisor called out to his crew. "All right, let's start depressurizing the system and getting the lift reset." Several workers moved toward the equipment. Arya turned quickly. "Wait." The word was calm, but firm enough to stop them. The supervisor frowned. What now? She stood slowly and gestured toward the rear section of the aircraft. The pressure release stabilized the lift, but it didn't reset the line. The supervisor blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means the hydraulic feed is still holding residual pressure," she said. The mechanic beside her scratched his head. "That could cause a secondary shift when we disengage the lift." Celine had been watching the entire exchange quietly from the safety line. Now she stepped closer. "You're saying it could collapse again?" Arya nodded. If someone pulls the lift without clearing the remaining pressure, the supervisor rubbed the back of his neck. Unbelievable. He turned toward the engineers. "Hold off on disengaging the lift." Several of them groaned in frustration. "We just stabilized it." "Yeah, and if you rush the reset, you'll destabilize it again," the mechanic replied. Doria Hallberg, standing a few steps behind Celine, watched the scene unfold with narrowed eyes. The runway lights reflected sharply across her expression. She had built an empire by trusting expertise. Yet somehow tonight, that expertise had come from the one person she had dismissed. Her voice cut across the runway. "So now she's in charge of aircraft recovery too?" No one responded. Because the engineers were looking at Arya again. Waiting. The supervisor sighed heavily. "All right, what's the next step?" Arya hesitated. The weight of everyone's attention pressed against her shoulders. She wasn't used to leading rooms full of professionals. But the system in front of her didn't care about titles. Machines only cared about physics. "Two of you need to manually relieve the secondary valve behind the rear brace," she said. The supervisor pointed at two engineers. "You heard her." They moved quickly toward the rear of the aircraft. Arya turned back to the front brace, crouching again beside the hydraulic cylinder. Her hand hovered over the stabilizer rod. She could feel the subtle vibration still running through it. Not dangerous. Yet, Celine stepped quietly beside her. "You noticed that right away," she said softly. Arya shrugged. "Pressure systems always leave traces." Celine glanced at her pocket. "The medal, does it belong to your guardian?" Arya nodded. "He earned it during a rescue operation overseas." Celine's voice softened. "And he taught you all this?" "Everything I know." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind swept across the runway again, carrying the distant hum of airport traffic. Behind them, Doria Hallberg continued watching silently. The billionaire's gaze lingered on the girl kneeling beside the aircraft. Not with mockery now. but with calculation. Something about Arya unsettled her, not because she had saved the jet, but because she had done it without needing recognition. Across the runway, one of the engineers called out. Secondary valve ready, Arya stood again. Open it slowly. The engineer turned the release wheel. Another sharp hiss escaped from the hydraulic system. The stabilizer rod beneath the wing relaxed slightly. Arya nodded. Good, keep going. The hiss continued for several seconds before fading. The aircraft remained perfectly still. The supervisor exhaled. Pressures clearing. A wave of relief spread through the team. Arya stepped back from the lift. You can disengage the brace now. The engineers carefully released the stabilizer. The hydraulic lift lowered smoothly. No grinding, no sudden shifts. The aircraft settled safely onto its landing gear. A loud cheer erupted from the runway crew. The supervisor laughed in disbelief. That's it, we're clear. Several engineers slapped each other on the back. Mateo's rescue vehicle drove past them toward the terminal. Inside it, the injured technician lifted his hand weakly through the window toward Arya. She gave a small nod. Celine smiled. You saved him twice. Arya shook her head. I just paid attention. The supervisor approached her again. You know, if you ever wanted a job here. Doria Halberg suddenly stepped forward. Her heels clicked sharply against the concrete. Enough. The single word cut through the celebration. Everyone turned toward her. The billionaire's gaze moved slowly across the group before settling on Arya. You've certainly made quite an impression tonight. Her voice was calm. Too calm, but there was something different behind her eyes now. Not arrogance, not quite respect either. Something closer to realization. She studied Arya carefully. Then asked the question that had been forming since the medal appeared. Tell me something, Doria said quietly. Where exactly did a maintenance girl learn to command a runway full of engineers? The wind pushed across the runway again, tugging at jackets and loose tool straps. The celebration among the engineers faded into uneasy silence. Arya didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted toward the aircraft one last time, confirming the landing gear had fully settled and the hydraulic system had stopped vibrating. Only then did she look back. From someone who believed machines shouldn't scare people, she said calmly. Doria tilted her head slightly. That's not an answer. Celine stepped closer to Arya. You said your guardian trained you, she said gently. Was he stationed here? Arya shook her head. No. The engineering supervisor folded his arms, curiosity replacing his earlier tension. Then where? For a moment, Arya simply watched the wind sweep across the empty runway. The flashing emergency lights painted slow red reflections across the polished body of the jet. He trained rescue teams, she said quietly. The mechanic beside her raised an eyebrow. Air Force? Arya nodded once. Several engineers exchanged glances. That makes sense, the supervisor muttered. The stabilization sequence you used, that's military rescue protocol. Celine's eyes widened slightly. So you grew up around aircraft rescues? Arya hesitated. Then she nodded again. My guardian believed you should understand how machines fail before you ever trust them. The supervisor laughed softly. Smart man, Doria Halberg studied her carefully. You expect us to believe an orphan girl learned advanced rescue engineering in a hangar somewhere? The question wasn't cruel. But it was skeptical. Arya didn't seem offended. He taught me every night, she said. Sometimes in old hangars. Sometimes with broken equipment he'd bring home. Celine smiled faintly. That actually sounds kind of amazing. The mechanic nodded. Honestly, it explains a lot. Arya reached into her pocket again. This time she didn't hide the medal. The small silver disc rested in her palm under the runway lights. The engraved eagle gleamed clearly now. The engineer, who had noticed it earlier, leaned forward. "I knew it," he said under his breath. He pointed toward the emblem. "That's the Air Force Combat Rescue Engineering insignia." The supervisor's eyebrows shot up. "That's not something civilians carry." Celine looked at the medal in wonder. "Your guardian earned that?" Arya nodded. "He saved a crew trapped in a collapsed transport aircraft." Her voice softened slightly. "He didn't talk about it much." Doria crossed her arms again. "And yet somehow you learned the same techniques." Arya closed her hand around the medal. "He believed knowledge shouldn't die with the person who earned it." The runway fell quiet again. The engineers looked at her differently now. Not as a stranger, not as a lucky bystander, but as someone who had inherited something valuable. The supervisor rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "That explains why you spotted the hydraulic imbalance so fast." The mechanic chuckled. "Honestly, she spotted it faster than we did." Celine glanced toward her mother. "Mom, she saved your aircraft." Doria didn't respond immediately. Her gaze moved slowly across the runway. The jet. The engineers. The girl holding the rescue medal. Minutes earlier, she had ordered security to remove that same girl from the executive lounge. Now, the same people who worked on her aircraft were looking to Arya for guidance. The irony was impossible to ignore. Finally, Doria spoke again. "You realize something, don't you?" Everyone waited. Her voice was quieter now. "That aircraft is worth $60 million. The supervisor nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Doria gestured toward Arya. "And it was stabilized by someone who isn't even on the payroll." The mechanic chuckled softly. "Seems that way." Celine folded her arms thoughtfully. "Maybe payroll isn't the only way someone proves their value." The comment hung in the air. Arya slipped the medal back into her pocket. "I didn't do it for the aircraft," she said. Her eyes drifted toward the terminal road where the ambulance carrying Matteo had disappeared. "I did it for him." The supervisor nodded slowly. "That's the difference between someone who fixes machines and someone who rescues people." Doria watched Arya carefully again. This time the billionaire's expression carried something new. Respect. Reluctant, but real. Across the runway, airport staff had begun reopening sections of the terminal after the emergency lockdown. The flashing warning lights were shutting off one by one. The crisis was officially over. Celine smiled faintly. "You know, if you ever want to tell the full story about your guardian and how he trained you, I'd actually love to hear it." Arya shrugged lightly. "It's not that interesting." The mechanic laughed. "You stabilized a failing jet and saved a trapped technician in front of half the airport." He pointed toward the terminal. "I think that story already wrote itself." Before anyone could reply, Arya glanced briefly toward the camera of a nearby security pole mounted near the runway. Then, she smiled slightly. "If you're enjoying this story so far," she said quietly, "make sure you subscribe, because the next moment might surprise you even more." Celine blinked. "Wait, what next moment?" Arya turned her eyes toward Doria Hallberg. Because the real reversal hadn't happened yet. Doria Hallberg stood motionless for several seconds, the wind tugging lightly at the edge of her coat while the runway slowly returned to normal around them. Emergency lights were shutting down. Engineers rolled equipment carts back toward the hangar. But the atmosphere between the people standing near the aircraft had changed. Everyone knew something important had just happened. And everyone knew who had made it happen. Doria's eyes stayed on Arya. For the first time since the crisis began, the billionaire spoke without sharpness. "You said your guardian trained you." Arya nodded. "Yes." Doria stepped closer, heels clicking against the concrete. "And he taught you aircraft rescue engineering?" "Yes." The billionaire studied her for another moment. You realize, Doria continued, that the technique you used tonight isn't common knowledge. The supervisor nodded in agreement. She's right. That stabilization sequence is specialized training. Celine folded her arms, glancing between them. So basically, she knew what none of you knew. The mechanic laughed quietly. Pretty much, Doria ignored the comment. Her attention remained entirely on the girl standing in front of her. Where is this guardian now? The question lingered in the cool runway air. Arya's fingers brushed the metal in her pocket again. He passed away, she said softly. Celine's expression immediately softened. I'm sorry, Arya gave a small shrug. He always said knowledge only matters if someone carries it forward. The supervisor nodded slowly. Sounds like a man who understood responsibility. Doria was silent for a moment. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the jet. The aircraft that had nearly collapsed. The aircraft that had been saved by the girl she had dismissed minutes earlier. Then she looked back at Arya. You work around the maintenance areas here? Sometimes, Arya said. Helping the crews? Yes. The billionaire's tone sharpened slightly. And yet no one here mentioned that the airport apparently employs a hidden rescue engineer. The supervisor chuckled. Technically, we don't employ her. Celine glanced toward Arya again. You just help because you want to? Arya shrugged. People need help sometimes. The mechanic shook his head with a grin. That's the understatement of the year. The supervisor crossed his arms. You realize you probably prevented a full structural collapse tonight. Arya didn't respond. Because she had already calculated that possibility the moment she saw the lift shift. Doria Halberg took another step forward. The engineers instinctively moved aside. The billionaire stopped directly in front of Arya now. Close enough to see the grease stains on her sleeves. Close enough to notice the calm expression that hadn't changed once during the entire crisis. You know, Doria said slowly, 10 minutes ago I had security remove you from my lounge. Arya met her gaze, yes. Celine shifted uncomfortably beside them. The supervisor glanced down at his boots. Even the mechanic stopped smiling. Doria continued. I said you didn't belong there. The runway wind whispered across the concrete between them. Arya didn't react, not with anger, not with embarrassment, just quiet acknowledgement. Doria studied her for another long moment. You could have walked away after that, she said. But you didn't. Arya glanced briefly toward the aircraft. There was someone trapped. The supervisor nodded again. That's the part people don't usually understand. Celine looked at Arya with quiet admiration. You helped anyway. Arya slipped her hands into her pockets. My guardian used to say emergencies don't care about pride. The mechanic laughed softly. Smart man, Doria Halberg slowly turned away from her. For a second it looked like the conversation might end there. But then the billionaire faced the gathered engineers instead. Her voice carried across the runway clearly. I want something confirmed. The supervisor straightened. Yes, ma'am? Doria pointed toward the aircraft. Without her intervention tonight, what would have happened? The engineers exchanged glances. The supervisor answered honestly. The front brace would have collapsed. Another engineer nodded. The wing probably would have dropped. The mechanic added quietly, and with that fuel leak, it could have turned into a fire. Silence followed. Doria looked back at Arya. For the first time, there was no skepticism in her expression, only realization. You didn't just save a technician, she said. Her voice had softened now. You saved everyone standing on this runway. Arya didn't answer. She simply looked toward the terminal lights glowing in the distance. Because for her, the most important part had already happened. Mateo Cruz was alive. And sometimes that was enough. But the people standing around her were only beginning to understand what they had witnessed, and the moment that would change everything had not happened yet. And the moment that would change everything had not happened yet. The runway had grown quiet again. Most of the engineers were returning equipment to the hangar, their earlier excitement fading into tired relief. The crisis had passed. The aircraft stood stable on its landing gear, perfectly still beneath the dimming emergency lights, but the small group around Arya hadn't moved. Doria Halberg was still watching her, carefully, as if reevaluating something she thought she understood about the world. Celine noticed it too. "Mom," she said gently. Doria didn't look at her. Her eyes remained on the girl standing in grease-stained sleeves beside the aircraft. "Do you understand something, Arya?" Doria asked. The name sounded different now, no longer dismissive, just measured. Arya tilted her head slightly. "What?" Doria gestured toward the jet. "That aircraft is one of the most advanced private aircraft systems in the country." The supervisor nodded slowly. "True," Doria continued. "It is maintained by engineers with decades of training." The mechanic crossed his arms. "Also true." Then Doria pointed directly at Arya. "And yet tonight, a girl who doesn't even officially work here solved the crisis." The runway fell silent again. Arya shrugged lightly. "I just paid attention." Celine smiled faintly. "You did more than that." Doria took another slow step forward. "Why didn't you mention your training earlier?" Arya looked confused. No one asked. The supervisor chuckled quietly. "That's actually fair," but Doria wasn't smiling. She studied Arya's calm expression, trying to understand the quiet confidence behind it. "You were sitting in the lounge earlier," the billionaire said. "Yes, you knew what that aircraft was?" "Yes. And when you saw the emergency outside, you understood what was happening?" Arya nodded once. Celine blinked. "So you already knew how dangerous it was?" "Yes." Doria crossed her arms again. "But instead of announcing that knowledge immediately, you waited." Arya glanced briefly toward the aircraft again. They weren't ready to listen yet. The mechanic laughed softly. "That might be the most accurate thing anyone said tonight." The supervisor nodded. "Honestly, she's right." Doria tilted her head slightly. "So you're telling me you predicted exactly how the situation would unfold?" Arya shrugged again. "I've seen similar failures." Celine looked at her curiously. "During your Guardian's training?" "Yes." Doria remained quiet for several seconds. Then she turned toward the engineers. "I want a complete report on tonight's incident." The supervisor nodded. "Of course. But before you write it," Doria added calmly, "I want something included." Everyone looked at her. Doria gestured toward Arya. "The report will clearly state that the stabilization plan came from her." The mechanic grinned. "That won't be hard to prove." Several engineers nodded in agreement. Celine smiled proudly at Arya. "Looks like you're officially part of airport history now." Arya shook her head slightly. "That's not necessary." But the supervisor raised a finger. "Actually, it is." He pointed toward the aircraft. "That situation could have gone very wrong." Another engineer added quietly, "We all know it." Doria studied Arya one more time. "You also prevented significant damage to my aircraft." Arya gave a small nod. "Yes." The billionaire exhaled slowly. Then something surprising happened. Doria Halberg extended her hand. The movement stunned everyone standing nearby. The mechanic whispered under his breath, "Well, I'll be." Celine's eyes widened. Her mother rarely offered gestures like that, especially not to strangers. Doria's voice remained calm. "You have my thanks." Arya looked at the offered hand for a moment. Then she shook it. Her grip was steady, unshaken by the wealth or authority standing in front of her. Glad Mateo is safe, she said. Doria released her hand. And the aircraft? Arya shrugged lightly. That too, Celine laughed. You're impossible. The supervisor clapped his hands together. Well, I think tonight officially qualifies as the strangest shift in airport history. The mechanic grinned. Definitely the most interesting. Across the runway, the last emergency vehicle drove away. The crisis was over, the aircraft remained safe, and the girl who had been thrown out of the executive lounge stood quietly among the engineers who now respected her. Doria Halberg turned toward the terminal building, then paused. She looked back at Arya one more time. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the girl's jacket pocket, toward the metal hidden inside. Tell me something, Doria said thoughtfully. Arya looked up. Yes? The billionaire's voice softened slightly. Does that metal in your pocket have a story? Arya smiled faintly. Yes. Celine leaned forward eagerly. What kind of story? Arya glanced toward the runway lights glowing across the night sky. The kind that explains why my guardian never cared where someone came from. She paused. Only what they chose to do when things went wrong. And the people standing there were about to learn exactly what that meant. The wind across the runway had softened now, carrying only the distant hum of engines from the far end of the airport. Most of the crew had returned to their stations, but a few engineers still lingered near the aircraft, quietly discussing the incident. Arya stood where she was, calm as ever. Doria Halberg's gaze had not left her. You said the metal has a story, the billionaire said slowly. Arya nodded once. Celine stepped closer, curiosity bright in her eyes. I want to hear it. For a moment, Arya looked down at the concrete beneath her boots. Then she reached into her pocket again. The metal appeared in her palm once more. Under the runway lights, the silver surface glowed softly. The engraved eagle and shield were worn from years of handling. The supervisor leaned forward slightly. That's definitely combat rescue engineering. Arya ran her thumb across the metal. My guardian earned it 15 years ago, she said quietly. Celine tilted her head. For what? Arya glanced toward the aircraft behind them, an accident almost exactly like tonight's. The mechanic's eyebrows shot up. Seriously? Arya nodded. A cargo transport collapsed during a landing failure. The hydraulic braces snapped and part of the fuselage pinned 3 crew members underneath. The supervisor listened carefully now. That's a nightmare scenario, it was, Arya said softly. Celine's voice dropped to a whisper. And he saved them? Arya nodded again. He crawled under the aircraft while the rescue team tried to stabilize it. The mechanic shook his head. That's insane. Arya smiled faintly. He used to say the scariest part wasn't the metal above you. Everyone waited. It was the moment when people outside stopped believing it could be fixed. The runway lights flickered as a service vehicle passed in the distance. Arya looked down at the metal again. He stabilized the aircraft long enough for the crew to be pulled out. The supervisor nodded slowly. That's exactly what you did tonight. Arya slipped the metal back into her pocket. He taught me the same process. Doria Halberg had been silent throughout the story. Now she spoke again. And he raised you after that? Arya nodded. My parents died when I was little. Celine's expression softened immediately. I'm sorry, Arya gave a small shrug. He said the best way to honor people you lose is to become someone useful. The mechanic chuckled quietly. Well, mission accomplished. Several engineers nodded in agreement. Doria studied Arya again, but now the billionaire's expression carried none of the cold dismissal from earlier. Instead, something deeper had replaced it. Regret. She took a slow breath. Arya. The girl looked up. Doria continued. Earlier tonight I said you didn't belong in the executive lounge. Arya didn't reply. She simply waited. Celine glanced between them nervously. The runway felt strangely quiet again. Doria's voice was steady now. That was wrong. The supervisor's eyebrows rose slightly. The mechanic blinked. Because hearing a billionaire admit a mistake wasn't common. Doria continued. I judged you based on appearance. Arya nodded slightly. That happens a lot. The honesty in her voice wasn't bitter, just factual. Doria looked toward the aircraft again. Tonight proved something important. Celine smiled faint. That respect shouldn't depend on money. Doria glanced at her daughter. Yes. Then she turned back to Arya. You belonged there more than anyone in that room. The words settled over the runway like a quiet shift in gravity. Arya didn't react dramatically. She just gave a small smile. My guardian used to say something similar. Doria raised an eyebrow. What? Arya looked around the runway. At the engineers, at the aircraft. At the terminal glowing in the distance. He said the world often confuses power with value. The mechanic chuckled. That's a good line, Arya nodded. But emergencies reveal the difference. Celine folded her arms thoughtfully. Because the person who actually solves the problem becomes the most important one, Arya smiled. Exactly. Doria Halberg studied her again. For a moment, the billionaire looked like someone who had just discovered a truth she hadn't noticed before. Finally, she spoke. You saved my aircraft, Arya nodded. Yes. You saved an employee's life, yes. Doria paused. And you did it after I treated you like you didn't belong. Arya met her gaze calmly. Yes. Silence followed. Then Doria Halberg did something no one on that runway expected. She stepped aside, clearing the path back toward the executive terminal. You're welcome in my lounge any time, she said. The supervisor smiled. The mechanic laughed quietly. Celine grinned, but Arya simply slipped her hands into her pockets and looked out across the runway lights. Because the real victory had never been about the lounge. It had always been about proving something far more important. The runway had grown quiet again. The last of the emergency vehicles disappeared beyond the hangar doors, and the flashing red lights that had once painted the aircraft in warning slowly faded back to normal runway glow. Night settled over the airport. Arya stood near the aircraft a moment longer, watching the engineers secure the final equipment. The massive jet that had nearly collapsed now looked perfectly calm, as if the crisis had never happened. The supervisor walked past her with a clipboard and gave a small nod. Maintenance team will take it from here, he said. But I'll make sure the official report mentions exactly who stabilized the situation. Arya shook her head slightly. That's not necessary. The mechanic chuckled. Maybe not for you. But it matters to the rest of us. Nearby, Celine Halberg leaned against a safety barrier, arms folded as she studied the runway lights. You know, she said thoughtfully, I think this entire airport just learned something tonight. Arya glanced at her. What? Celine smiled faintly. That the person everyone overlooks might be the most important one in the room. Arya shrugged. My guardian used to say something similar. Celine tilted her head. What did he say? Arya looked out across the open runway again, remembering the countless evenings spent in quiet hangars with the man who had raised her. He said the world always looks upward for power, she replied softly. Celine waited. But the people who actually hold things together, Arya continued, are usually standing somewhere no one bothered to notice. Celine nodded slowly. That sounds exactly like tonight. Behind them, footsteps approached across the concrete. Doria Halberg. The billionaire had been speaking with the engineering supervisor near the jet, but now she walked toward Arya and Celine. Her posture was calmer than before, less rigid. The arrogance that had filled her voice earlier that evening seemed distant now. She stopped beside them and looked across the runway. "I've owned aircraft for 20 years, she said quietly. Neither girl interrupted. "I've seen mechanical failures, emergency landings, and engineering teams work under pressure." Her gaze drifted briefly toward Arya, but tonight I witnessed something I hadn't expected. Celine raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Doria exhaled slowly, a reminder that expertise doesn't always wear expensive suits. The mechanic nearby laughed softly under his breath. Arya didn't laugh, she simply watched the runway. Doria continued. "When I told security to remove you from the lounge," she said, "I assumed I understood exactly who belonged there." Arya glanced at her briefly. "And now?" Doria looked out toward the aircraft. "Now I realize I almost pushed away the one person who could solve the problem none of us understood." Celine smiled faintly. "Good thing she stayed anyway." Arya shrugged. Matteo needed help. The paramedics had already confirmed that the technician would recover fully. The thought made her relax slightly. Across the runway, the aircraft's maintenance lights flickered off one by one. The jet stood quiet and still. The crisis had passed. But something else had changed too. The engineers now greeted Arya with nods as they passed. The mechanic lifted a hand toward her before heading back into the hangar. Even Garrick Holt, the security chief, paused near the terminal door and gave a respectful incline of his head, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. Doria Halberg watched those interactions carefully. Then she turned toward Arya one last time. "You know something?" the billionaire said. Arya looked up. "You carry that medal like it belongs to your guardian," Doria continued. "It does." Doria nodded. "But tonight," she added, "you proved you earned it too." Arya didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the pocket where the medal rested. Her guardian had once told her the same thing might happen someday, not because she wanted recognition, but because someone, somewhere, would eventually see what quiet dedication looked like. She lifted her eyes again toward the runway lights. "Maybe," she said softly. Celine smiled. "I think he'd be proud." Arya nodded once. "I hope so." The wind drifted across the open tarmac again. Planes taxied slowly in the distance. Life at the airport continued, just as it always had, but for everyone who witnessed what happened that night, one lesson would stay with them. Sometimes the person power tries to ignore is the one holding everything together. Ask me for the next story title. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. The janitor they laughed at fixed the billionaire's private jet and revealed the truth no one expected. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?